Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Global Realignment Podcast. I want to thank everybody for joining me today. Today, we're going to be discussing the resumption of hostilities between Israel and Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Now, as many of you know, prior to Trump's inauguration, Special Envoy to the Middle East Steve Witkoff, in conjunction with officials from the Biden administration, brokered a three-phase ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas. And what I want to do first of all is just kind of dig into the details of the first two phases of the ceasefire agreement, just as a refresher. Now, the first phase of the ceasefire was to last 42 days. And Hamas was to release 25 living Israeli hostages and 8 deceased hostages from Gaza. Israel was to release 1,900 Palestinian prisoners and detainees, and Israeli forces were to leave the populated areas of Gaza, and the displaced Palestinians would return to their neighborhoods, particularly in the northern half of the Gaza Strip. Now, also, humanitarian aid was to resume, and Israeli troops that remained in Gaza were to be withdrawn to the periphery of the Gaza Strip, particularly in this security zone that they've extended that borders the Gaza Strip. They were also to withdraw from the Netzarim corridor, which is a military corridor that was built throughout the duration of the war that bisected the Gaza Strip. Now, the second phase, negotiations on the second phase were meant to begin 16 days after the start of the first phase of the ceasefire. And those negotiations never were fruitful, even after the expiration of the first phase of the ceasefire. And like the first stage, the duration was to be 42 days. Now, according to the second phase of the ceasefire, a permanent ceasefire was to be negotiated and established, which, of course, was never a component that Israel would have ever agreed with, because their stated goals since the start of hostilities after October 7th was the complete eradication of Hamas, obviously an impossibility because of the nature of a terrorist organization, but that's their stated goals. The remaining living hostages in Gaza were to be exchanged for more Palestinian prisoners, and Israeli forces were to make a complete withdrawal from the Strip, which again doesn't necessarily conflict with Israel's larger goals for Gaza, but withdrawal of their military forces and security forces does conflict with their endgame for Gaza, because while they may not want to govern and administer the Gaza Strip and whoever is left there, they do want a security presence there. And we're not going to get into the details of the third phase because, as we can tell right now, they aren't going to be reaching the third phase, as far as I could tell. That's my opinion. Now, one of the issues that sprung from this ceasefire agreement, particularly for Israel, it's the idea that Israel wanted an extension, as we discussed in a previous video, of the first phase of the ceasefire, which Hamas rejected. Israel never wanted to get to a place, once again, where they had to abide by a long-term ceasefire or potentially withdraw completely from the Gaza Strip. This led, now, their rejection of moving to phase 2 and this idea of extending the first phase of the ceasefire and Hamas's rejection of that didn't immediately lead to hostilities, but further negotiations did take place in conjunction with Israel reimposing a blockade on the Gaza Strip and cutting off electricity and water to the Strip. Now, earlier last week, Steve Witkoff, again, the special envoy for the Middle East from Trump's administration, presented Israel and Hamas with a new outline to extend the first phase of the ceasefire. Once again, we take a look at this initiative that Steve Witkoff presented to both parties. We understand how this initiative favors Israel, because it just builds off of the idea that they had initially of extending the first phase of the ceasefire, which Hamas rejected. He wanted the extension for several weeks, specifically 42 to 50 days in exchange for the release of 5 living and 10 dead hostages. Now, I think that one thing that we have to recognize is that these hostages obviously are Hamas's leverage. And so this idea of exchanging hostages while continuing supposed negotiations that are really going nowhere doesn't benefit Hamas at all. So we can understand why they've decided to reject anything like an extension or Steve Witkoff's idea of an extension. Now, sources report the extension would give U.S. additional time to negotiate a longer-term truce. And again, this idea of a longer-term truce is not on the agenda for Israel. This isn't something that they're interested in. And I might add, the Trump administration for many months has expressed support for Israel continuing to wrap up Hamas and completely eradicating them. And so the idea of a long-term truce in the Trump administration is also a non-starter. Now, following these proposals by Steve Witkoff, Hamas last Friday announced it would agree to release a dual U.S.-Israeli citizen named Aiden Alexander and the bodies of 4 other dual citizens that are hostages in Gaza, in exchange for the start of phase 2 of the ceasefire agreement, which Israel automatically rejected. Netanyahu said that Hamas was just trying to manipulate and confuse the people who are the public and the negotiators. Now, this position Hamas took, right, of releasing these dual citizens has been said to have sprung from diplomacy initiated by an Adam Bowler, who is a U.S. hostage envoy in the Middle East for the Trump administration. And we'll be getting into more of that background and his background later on. Because Adam Bowler, one of his main interests in negotiations that he had opened up with Hamas was returning these dual citizens, these American-Israeli dual citizens. So we'll be looking into that in a second. And we'll also be looking into how all of this ties together with the recent resumption of hostilities by the Houthis in Yemen against commercial cargo ships in the Red Sea, and Donald Trump's subsequent bombing of certain positions in Yemen of the Houthi rebels that took place over this weekend. And so those are the 2 stories that we're going to get into. And also we'll be touching on the resumption of hostilities between Israel and Hamas that started back, I believe it was this past night. Time differences between the U.S. and Israel. So the first article that we're going to get into is from the Journal, and this is related to, again, the special envoy, the hostage negotiator named Adam Bowler that was negotiating directly with Hamas. And of course, this is something that's foreign to the U.S. foreign policy establishment, because the idea has always been that we don't negotiate with terrorists. And so this was kind of a surprise to me when I came across it. And it was even more surprising reading the response that Adam Bowler had after having these initial discussions with Hamas. So President Trump's hostage envoy suggested Hamas was willing to lay down its arms in exchange for a truce, and said the U.S. has interests that are separate from Israel's, in comments on Israeli television that further frustrated some Israeli officials already concerned by his direct talks with the militant group. And one thing I will mention is that it was Israel that leaked the nature and the fact that these discussions were even happening to the public, largely, in my opinion, to disrupt and throw a wrench into any of these negotiations. Now, Adam Bowler said his main goal in the talks was the release of the last American hostage who remains alive in Gaza. But he also told Israeli public broadcaster Can News that Hamas had offered a 5 to 10-year truce under which it would release all hostages in exchange for all Palestinian prisoners. They'd lay down their arms and allow the U.S. and others to ensure the removal of its vast tunnel system and withdraw from politics. Now, I don't believe that they would do any of those things. I think maybe to some extent they might fulfill some of those. They may have fulfilled some of those promises, but I think that largely we would take those overtures with a grain of salt, right? It doesn't mean, in my estimation, that those negotiations should stop. Now, like I said earlier, it has been a policy of the U.S. not to negotiate with terrorists such as Hamas. However, given the circumstances and given how far this war has gone and the cost of civilian life over the past year and a half-ish, negotiations don't sound too bad right now to facilitate some kind of long-term truce. But again, that's not the goal of the Israelis or the U.S. But again, reading some of these points that Hamas has put out, that some of the things that they were looking at doing if there was a deal made, it just doesn't seem too realistic that many of those things would have been fulfilled, especially the idea of them withdrawing from politics. Because we have to remember, the idea is that, if we look at that language, they promised to withdraw from politics. Well, Israel wants them completely out of the Gaza Strip. So that's a non-starter. Bowler called the proposal not a bad first offer and suggested a new deal could come together in weeks. The decision to directly negotiate with Hamas, a U.S.-designated terrorist organization, and Bowler's positive remarks about its proposal drew criticism from Israeli officials who said the move weakened the country's negotiating hand. And I don't think that their negotiating hand was weakened. I just think that basically the idea of the U.S. potentially even speaking to these people seriously in negotiations, I'm talking about Hamas, is completely out the door for Israel. That's a non-starter for them. Again, which is why they leaked this information in the first place, in my estimation. So Bowler's remarks added to the confusion about U.S. policy. And that's true. And I want to stop again just to say that given the hawkish position that the Trump administration has taken on behalf of Israel against Hamas and Iran and, Yemen and the Houthis, having this guy going over and directly negotiating with Hamas and listening to some of the remarks from him surprised even me, because I guess there must be a core of, potential moderates within Trump's administration relative to this situation in the Middle East. So it was surprising to me that, to find out that this was happening behind the scenes. So Trump has signaled no similar priority to broker a permanent ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. He has allowed Israel to cut off aid and electricity to the enclave with no public pushback. He has also repeatedly said the decision to end the war rests with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And that's kind of what I was saying earlier. Netanyahu and Trump's initiatives and goals for Gaza are basically, aligned. So during the Biden administration, Israeli officials often complained that Hamas would harden its negotiating stance whenever it saw daylight between Washington and Israel. And so, there are those, I'm sure, that think that these statements made by Hamas during these negotiations with Adam Bowler were meant to divide Washington and Israel. And as far as I'm concerned, that's not possible at this point. So it should be noted, and this is just some notes from me, it should be noted that these negotiations were leaked, like we mentioned earlier. And it was later reported that Adam Bowler actually withdrew his nomination to be Trump's top hostage negotiator in this region, which is interesting. Again, I'm sure that given the consensus within the Trump administration relative to the situation in Israel and Gaza and the very pro-Israeli sentiment within Trump's administration, this guy and whoever may have been around him must have been a minority voice in the administration. And so he withdrew his nomination, and I think he's taking a lesser role within the administration. He's not completely stepping away from the administration. And so chalk up another win for Israel in that regard. And now we're going to move on to the situation with the Houthis in Yemen. And again, like we talked about earlier, there were airstrikes this weekend against Houthi positions in Yemen after their resumption of targeting commercial ships that were passing through the Red Sea. This is from the New York Times. President Trump ordered large-scale military strikes on targets controlled by the group that it said killed at least 31 people. The Iran-backed group said women and children were among those killed in the strikes on Saturday, the most significant U.S. military action in the Middle East since Mr. Trump took office in January. For more than a year, the Houthis have launched attacks against Israel and threatened commercial shipping in the Red Sea in solidarity with their allies, Hamas. And the Houthi rebels, who control most of northern Yemen, had temporarily halted attacks in the Red Sea, and we'll get to that in a moment, when a ceasefire took effect in Gaza in January. But last week they announced they would target any Israeli ships violating their ban on Israeli vessels passing through the Red Sea, the Arabian Sea, the Bab el-Mandeb, and the Gulf of Aden. And so, again, these resumption of, or the airstrikes that Trump carried out was due to the Houthis' resumption of strikes on commercial vessels, this time particularly Israeli vessels going through the Red Sea and these other bodies of water just mentioned. And the question is, why did the Houthis decide to start targeting these commercial ships? Well, it's because of the blockades being reinstated by Israel against Gaza, and also the suspension of the negotiations and the breaking apart of the ceasefire, right? And I would say that this was the plan basically from the start. Israel resumes hostilities against Hamas, reneging on the deal, the ceasefire deal. And they knew that this would directly contribute to the confrontation or to the continuation of Houthi targeting of commercial vessels in the Red Sea, which Israel knew would draw the U.S. into this situation, that they knew that this would draw a U.S. response. And the U.S. would respond, not only blaming or targeting the Houthis, but eventually, they're already blaming, but eventually targeting Iran as well. So this all basically comes full circle back around to Iran. And of course, Israel hopes to use the U.S. as the tip of the spear in a prospective attack against Iran, their nuclear facilities, thereby obviously drawing the U.S. into another, ultimately, regime change operation in Iran. And this has been the goal for Israel for decades. And Trump is not blindly walking into this. He knows exactly what's going on, but he's doing it deliberately. He's got many Israeli sponsors that got him past, and Jewish sponsors that got him past the finish line in 24. And so he's doing many of these things deliberately. And of course, who's culpable for it? Well, it's going to be presented as, well, Hamas broke the ceasefire arrangement. The Houthis just randomly started, targeting Israeli vessels in the Red Sea again. All of these things are going to be presented to the American people without context, thereby conjuring up the kind of support for some kind of intervention against Iran, which, of course, is being presented as basically the facilitator of all of these things. And we have to think back about some of Trump's comments that he's made about Iran, that he's still making to this day. For example, recently Trump announced that he sent a letter to the Ayatollah Khamenei, who is the head of Iran, proposing nuclear negotiations. If you remember, Trump pulled out of the nuclear deal that was brokered by the Obama administration and he's looking to open up negotiations to procure a new nuclear arrangement between Iran and the U.S. And Trump went on to say, he said, I hope you're going to negotiate because it's going to be a lot better for Iran, implicitly threatening them. And the Iranian president, Masoud Pezeshkian, has rejected negotiations with the U.S. under threats, telling President Donald Trump to do whatever the hell you want, according to Iranian state media. Now, personally, I do think that their current president does want to negotiate with Trump, but Ayatollah Khamenei, who's basically the ultimate authority in Iran, is very likely going to reject any kind of negotiations related to their nuclear program that they have in Iran. Now, Tehran, obviously, many of you probably know, Tehran has long said that its nuclear program is for peaceful purposes. However, the International Atomic Energy Agency has raised concern over Iran's increased enrichment activities, warning that uranium purity levels are approaching the threshold for weapons capability. And this is something that they've been saying basically for years, right? It's very similar to the situation that we saw unfold before we invaded Iraq, right? They have a nuclear weapon. They have a nuclear weapon. You know, Colin Powell standing in front of the UN with the whatever chemical he had, and it's basically, we're seeing something similar unfolding right now. They're developing one. They're developing one. They're 7 days away from one. They're a week away from one. The breakout is becoming shorter and shorter, and so we're being fed all of these things. It's getting many people excited. A lot of propaganda going around. And so we could be basically at the beginning of something much larger in terms of a confrontation between the U.S. and Iran because of this idea of their nuclear program being something that they are saying, something other than what they're saying in Iran. So we shall see. We have to remember we didn't trust Iraq either when we were told constantly by members of Iraq's government and Saddam, hey, we don't have nuclear weapons. So we'll see. Let's hope this isn't going to be a repeat of history. And again, as we illustrated earlier, this very intricate way that we're being drawn into a conflict with Iran has been the initiative for Israel from the very beginning, because decapitating Iran, whose national security is benefiting from something like that? Well, it's Israel's, right? Once again, the Trump administration is putting Israel's national security before U.S. national security. And Israel, in a way, when we look back at what happened before Trump's inauguration and this ceasefire that was brokered by Steve Witkoff, it was basically a PR win that Israel handed to Trump, right? It was a PR victory. They accepted the so-called ceasefire agreement brokered by Witkoff and the Biden team in exchange, basically, for a freer hand in the Gaza Strip when Hamas breaks the ceasefire, right? And so it's just more of the, tail wagging the dog. And I think the big question we have to ask ourselves at the end of the day is, what is Russia taking from this? When Russia is, basically sat down and faced with the, ceasefire proposal brokered by members of the Trump administration, what are they to think when they're looking at this ceasefire agreement brokered by the Trump administration between Israel and Hamas that just broke apart? How are they supposed to look at that, right? Is that supposed to, engender some kind of trust between the Russians and the U.S. when they see how carelessly they handled this ceasefire situation between Israel and Hamas? I don't think that trust is going to be there, but we'll see. And then, of course, the result that's still developing, and we'll touch on it briefly, but we'll probably be covering this more broadly as the news continues to unpack. But the result, of course, is Israeli forces launched the result of the breakdown of the ceasefire. Israeli forces launched large aerial attacks across the Gaza Strip early Tuesday morning in the first major strikes on the territory since Israeli ceasefire with Hamas began roughly 2 months ago. Gaza's health ministry said more than 400 people have been killed in the attacks, which raised the prospect of a return to all-out war. The attacks followed weeks of fruitless negotiations aimed at extending the fragile ceasefire, the first phase. That's something that many of these publications leave out, which began in mid-January and paused 15 months of devastating fighting on the territory. By midday Tuesday, it remained unclear whether the strikes were a brief attempt to force Hamas to compromise in the talks or the beginning of a new phase in the conflict. Just me taking a stab in the dark, I believe this is a new phase in the conflict, right? Again, I'll just briefly say it again. Israel breaks the ceasefire. The Houthis start targeting commercial vessels again in the Red Sea, particularly Israeli ones, drawing the U.S. in. The U.S. starts with Yemen and the Houthis, while also pointing the finger at Iran. Iran eventually gets drawn in, and you've got Israel and the U.S. targeting Iran. And who knows how that could look in their nuclear facilities. So we'll see what happens. We'll be paying close attention and monitoring any developments. And we will return later on this week and see where things are. I appreciate everyone joining me. Thanks.